This story is a fictional narrative inspired by dark folklore, historical mysteries, and supernatural horror. While it uses a historical setting and realistic detail to create atmosphere, all characters, events, and locations are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental. The story contains mature themes, including violence, death, and supernatural elements, which may be disturbing to some readers. Reader discretion is strongly advised. In the waning light of a pale October morning in 1892, Charles Holling leaned forward in his carriage as it creaked its way down the winding dirt road that led to the infamous Beaumont Plantation. The horses snorted nervously, their hooves hesitant with each step toward the sprawling estate. There was something about the air thick, sweet with the scent of cured tobacco that felt wrong. The locals had called it the smoke that never ceased. It hung low across the trees, as if the sky itself had turned to ash. Charles was not superstitious. At least he wasn't yet. Fresh from Richmond and eager for a chance to prove himself, Charles had accepted the position of estate overseer after reading an advertisement pinned to the back of a church bulletin board. The salary was double what others offered, and housing came with the position, a rare opportunity for a man trying to escape debt and disgrace. The catch? No one else had applied. And when he'd mentioned the Beaumont name to locals at the train station, they had gone silent. One woman even crossed herself. Another man muttered, "Don't let the land swallow you too." He had laughed then. Now, as the estate came into view, the laughter died in his throat. The Beaumont Plantation was a towering Gothic manor that looked stitched to the landscape like an infected scar. Its wooden siding, once white, had aged to the color of weathered bone. Dozens of acres of tobacco fields stretched behind the mansion like dark waves in a lifeless sea. Strange that, for such a massive operation, there were no visible workers in the fields. Not a single shout, song, or scuffle. Just silence and smoke. The carriage stopped. A hunched figure waited at the steps. Mr. Cletus Maine, the caretaker. He looked old enough to have been born during the Civil War and moved like someone half-buried already. "You must be Mr. Holling," he said in a voice as dry as crumpled leaves. "They said you'd come." "They?" Charles asked, stepping down. Cletus ignored the question. "I'll show you to your quarters. Supper's at 7. Do not wander the fields after sundown." "Is there a reason?" Charles asked, half-joking. "Ghosts among the rows?" Cletus turned. "No ghosts, sir. Ghosts are what's left behind. What's out there? Don't leave remains." Charles swallowed hard. The air tasted like smoke. Not just tobacco, but something deeper, burnt oil maybe. Or bone. Inside the manor, time had stood still. Chandeliers of tarnished brass hung like spiders. The walls were lined with faded portraits of pale-faced Beaumont ancestors, all watching with cold judgment. There was no warmth in the place. Not in the hearth, not in the food, not in the company. At dinner, Charles met the only other residents. Eleanor Beaumont, the matriarch, and her niece, Abigail. A quiet girl with strange violet eyes and a voice like whispering wind. Eleanor was regal, commanding, and perfectly polite, but her words carried undertones of warning. "You've chosen to become part of the land," she told Charles. "That's no small thing. Few who do ever truly leave." He nodded politely, unsure what she meant. After supper, Charles went to his quarters. The windows wouldn't close properly, and the air outside seemed to breathe against the glass. Sleep came reluctantly. At dawn, Charles set out to tour the plantation grounds. He expected to find dozens of laborers working the fields. Instead, he found only a handful. Men and women, most black, some white, all gaunt, silent and moving like ghosts. They wouldn't meet his eyes. He approached one man and offered a handshake. "Morning. I'm Charles Holling, the new overseer." The man wiped sweat from his brow, then stared at him. "Overseer? That what they told you?" "Yes," Charles replied, confused. The man dropped his tool and walked away without another word. Later, Charles met with Cletus in the estate's cramped records room. He wanted to understand why the plantation, which reportedly supported over 60 workers, had so few. What happened to the rest? He asked. Cletus didn't answer. Charles pointed at the ledger. 41 names are crossed out, all within a 2-month period last year. No records of them leaving, no payments, just gone. They're not here anymore, Cletus said. I can see that, but why aren't they? The old man sighed, his hands trembling as he opened a drawer and removed an old, brittle letter. He handed it to Charles. It read, "The land accepts only what it is owed. They worked, they stayed. The harvest demanded payment, and so it was given. Tell no one. Forget the 41. There was no signature, no explanation. That night, Charles stood at his window and watched the fields. Smoke curled up from the soil like incense. He saw shapes, figures that seemed human but moved too slowly, too deliberately. When he blinked, they were gone. The next morning, a worker was missing. His name was Elijah Turner, a father of 2. No one spoke of it. The land had swallowed another, and Charles began to understand. This was no ordinary plantation. It was a mouth, and it was always hungry. The sun rose reluctantly over the Beaumont Plantation, casting long shadows across the fields that seemed to stretch farther than the eye could see. Charles Holling stood at the edge of the southern field, his boots sinking slightly into the moist soil. Elijah Turner had vanished. Not a trace left behind. No footprints, no blood, no note of departure. One day present, the next swallowed whole. When Charles inquired with the other workers, he was met with silence. They averted their eyes. Some made quiet gestures, crossing their chests, touching the soil with their fingertips, or muttering beneath their breath. It was more than fear. It was ritual. Determined to understand what had happened, Charles visited the worker bunkhouse. It was a long wooden structure near the edge of the plantation. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, smoke, and something else, something metallic. As he stepped through the dimly lit corridor, a hush followed him like a stalking animal. One elderly woman sat in a rocking chair by the wall. Her back was hunched, eyes milky with age, but her presence was commanding. Her name was Mama Ruth. She had been on the plantation since before the Civil War, before freedom had arrived, and long before the missing 41. "You're the new man," she said, without turning. "I am," Charles replied cautiously. "Charles Holling. You've seen the smoke. You've felt the quiet. And now you're asking why mouths don't speak no more." Charles hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, what happened to Elijah? And the others before him?" Mama Ruth stopped rocking. "Some truths don't fit in books, Mr. Holling," she whispered. "Some truths are sown into the ground. This land, it listens. It remembers. It hungers." Charles crouched beside her. "Tell me what you know. I need to understand." She exhaled, a raspy breath that trembled like dry leaves in the wind. "It started long ago," she said. "Before the plantation had a name. Before the first Beaumonts claimed this land from the native tribes who once worshipped it, not as a god, but as a beast. They said the land beneath this estate was alive. It had rules. It gave but only if fed. The Beaumonts didn't just build on soil, they built on bones." Charles listened, stunned. 41 workers went missing last season. Before that, another 17. In 1849, 19. Always in clusters. Always after a good harvest. And no one reports it? No one investigates. She looked at him sharply. "You think the sheriff dares set foot here? You think men with guns and law can fight something rooted deeper than time? The Beaumonts own more than this land. They own silence. And silence keeps the fields green." Charles stood up, heart pounding. "Are you saying the Beaumont family is killing these workers?" "No," Mama Ruth whispered. "Not in the way you think. They don't slit throats or pull triggers. They offer. Every harvest, when the moon is full and the tobacco burns just right, the soil needs its due. Sometimes it's blood. Sometimes it's bodies. Sometimes it's something worse." "Something worse?" Charles asked. She leaned in. "They say the root mother chooses, that she walks the fields in smoke and shadow, that she marks the ones who won't see the sunrise. No one sees her face, just her silhouette, tall and twisted, with limbs like vines and eyes like coal. You dream of her before she comes. And once you see her, it's already too late. Charles shivered. That's folklore. Then why are men disappearing, Mr. Holling? She said softly. Why does no one fight it? Because we've seen what happens when you do. Later that evening, unable to shake Mama Ruth's story, Charles returned to the ledger room. He flipped through page after page, all showing irregularities, sudden staff reductions, missing names, no letters home, no wages collected. Whole families simply vanished off record. He pulled out a weathered journal tucked behind the ledgers. It was hand-bound, the edges scorched, the ink faded. The name inside read, Samuel Tice, one of the 41 missing. The journal was fragmented but disturbing. I saw her again. The field was empty, but she stood at the edge of the smoke, unmoving. She knows I see her. I should have left when Elijah did, but he never made it. They said she touched him in his sleep. He just never woke up. The soil breathes at night. I swear I heard a heart beating beneath the rose. And last night I found a finger in the fertilizer. A real human finger. Still warm. Miss Eleanor says it's all part of the yield. That the land rewards the faithful. That the dead are not gone, just rooted. I don't know how much longer I can pretend not to hear them whisper. Charles felt nauseated. The entries ended abruptly, no final farewell, no conclusion. Just blank pages. Suddenly, a noise. The sound of footsteps. He turned sharply but saw no one. Then a faint giggle. It wasn't joyous. It was hollow, distant, childlike, but wrong. He grabbed the journal and left. Outside, the fields glowed faintly beneath the full moon. Smoke curled low. From the shadows of the eastern row, Charles saw a figure, not quite walking, not quite gliding, disappear into the crops. It looked too tall to be human, and its limbs bent the wrong way. He ran after it, but when he reached the spot, there was nothing. No sign of movement, no broken stalks. Just soil, still breathing. That night, Charles couldn't sleep. His dreams were filled with rows of teeth beneath the earth, bones hanging from tobacco plants like fruit, and a voice, a woman's voice, whispering in his ear. They planted truth. It grew in blood. He awoke in sweat, hands shaking. On the wall near his bed, written in dirt, was a single word, rooted. Charles Holling had never been a man of superstition. Raised in a world of ledgers, contracts, and logic, he trusted documents over dreams. But by his third week on the Beaumont plantation, something deep in his gut began to stir. A quiet, crawling dread that logic could not explain. It began with the portraits. Each evening, as Charles wandered the manor to clear his head, he'd pause before the ancestral paintings that lined the main hallway. Stiff men in coats, pale women in gowns, all with eyes that seemed to follow him. But it was the background details that disturbed him most. Details he hadn't noticed before. Behind Jasper Beaumont, the plantation's founder, hung a curtain of tobacco leaves. Yet something writhed between them, a shadow with curled fingers. In the painting of Henrietta Beaumont, midwife and matriarch, a second face seemed to peer from the mirror beside her. And in one of Elijah Beaumont, a man said to have died in infancy. His depiction was full-grown, with black sap dripping from his hands. Were these artistic illusions, tricks of paint, or hidden truths? Determined to investigate the family's history, Charles sought access to the manor's forbidden library, a small room sealed behind a locked iron gate. Eleanor Beaumont had mentioned it only once, warning, "The past is best left buried." But one rainy night, when the household lay in silence and thunder rolled across the fields, Charles found the library door unlocked. It was as if the house wanted him to see. The room was suffocatingly cold. Shelves creaked under the weight of dusty tomes and yellowed scrolls. Old plantation records were stacked in piles, mixed with ancient manuscripts bound in leather, some etched with symbols Charles didn't recognize. The fireplace was unlit, yet the hearth was warm, as though someone had just left. He began digging. The first book to catch his eye was a Beaumont family tree, stretching back to the 1600s. But something was off. Certain names were written in red ink, all with small marks beside them. A curled root, a black circle, or what looked like an open mouth. These marked individuals were all listed as sacrificed, claimed, or absorbed. Among them, Elijah Beaumont, age 6, claimed in place of harvest. Dorian Beaumont, age 31, chosen by root mother during the drought of 1791. Seraphine Beaumont, age 19, gifted to soil after childbearing. It wasn't a family tree. It was a ledger of offerings. Suddenly, it became clear. The Beaumonts had not simply inherited wealth or land. They had inherited a pact. The next document was older still, written in French and faded beyond recognition. Charles used a magnifier to decipher it. It appeared to be a contract, signed in 1691 by Jasper Beaumont and addressed to an unnamed guardian of the land. The contract promised blood for bounty, sacrifice for fertility, silence for survival. A section translated roughly as, "From flesh shall rise crop, from crop shall rise fortune. Each seed sown must be mirrored by flesh sown. The root mother sees. The root mother decides. She is the harvester of bone." Charles stared at the page. Jasper hadn't just bought land. He'd bought favor. From something not of this world. The more he read, the deeper the horror grew. The Beaumonts were not victims of a curse. They were its architects. Generation after generation had willingly maintained the covenant to preserve the estate's riches and power. Some had tried to defy the pact and had suffered. The journal of Eleanor's own father, Sebastian Beaumont, chronicled his failed attempt to end the bloodline's bargain. In it, he described how he tried to burn the root effigy hidden beneath the estate's foundation, only for the fire to consume his children in their sleep, not his target. His final entry read, "She cannot be killed, only fed. My rebellion has cost me my sons. May God forgive me. I return to her tonight willingly so that no more suffer. I go to become soil." Sebastian's body was never found. Charles dropped the journal, bile rising in his throat. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth roared to life behind him. He turned. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Beaumont, dressed in black, holding a brass oil lantern. "You've seen it," she said calmly. Charles froze. "You knew I'd come here?" he asked. "I left it open for a reason," she replied. "You're not the first to question, but you may be the first to choose." "Choose what? To accept, or to resist? One grants life, the other death, and the land accepts both." Her eyes glimmered unnaturally in the firelight. "I know what this family has done," Charles said, "and I will not be a part of it." Eleanor sighed. "You think this is about choice, Mr. Holling? This estate doesn't survive on choice. Survives on debt. And debts must be paid." With that, she walked away, the library door creaking shut behind her, this time locking from the outside. Charles was trapped, but only for a moment. He found a hidden latch behind one of the bookshelves, a narrow stone passage used, perhaps, by slaves long ago. He crawled through it, heart pounding, eventually emerging into a root cellar beneath the house. There, in the dirt floor, he saw them, symbols carved into the soil. A crude wooden effigy, shaped like a woman with vines for hair and a jagged hole for a mouth, pulsed with warmth. Nearby, wilted bones and dried hands protruded from the earth, small like those of children. He turned and ran. Back in his quarters, Charles packed a bag. He would leave at first light, but when he stepped outside, the smoke was waiting. And from the fields came a sound. Not wind, not footsteps, but breathing. Long, deep, ancient. The night suffocated everything. There was no breeze, no song of insects, no rustling of trees. Only the slow, rhythmic breathing of the land and the whisper of smoke snaking through the fields like a living thing. Charles Holling stood at the edge of the tobacco rows, suitcase in hand, breath frozen in his throat. He had planned to flee, just run, board a carriage, find a train, and never look back. But something had changed. The land wouldn't let him go. His boots felt heavy, as if the soil were trying to hold him in place. The tobacco plants swayed gently, yet there was no wind. The smoke curled in his path, hurting him not toward the road, but into the fields. He should have resisted, but something in his blood responded, a pull primal and ancient. He stepped between the rows. The further he walked, the less the world made sense. The moon overhead flickered like a dying lantern. The plants whispered, leaves brushing his arms like fingers. He could hear names murmured in the wind. Elijah, Samuel, Ruth, names of the missing, names he should not know. Then he saw it, a patch of earth where the tobacco had refused to grow, a perfect circle of bare soil. At its center, a door. Half buried in the dirt was a rusted iron trapdoor, barely visible, its handle crusted in dried mud and time. It looked far older than the house itself. A single word was etched into its face, nearly worn away by decades of weather. Offering. Charles knelt, heart racing. Against every instinct, he pried it open. A moan of stale air rose from the darkness below. What lay beneath wasn't a cellar. It wasn't a bunker. It was a network. Stone steps descended into the earth. He took a lantern from the wall and descended, careful not to slip on the damp, moss-covered stairs. As he moved deeper, the air turned foul, thick with rot, decay, and something sweet. At the base, he stepped into a massive chamber carved from stone and root. The walls pulsed as if alive, woven with ancient vines and bones. Narrow corridors branched in all directions. He walked carefully, lantern in hand, and passed through. A chamber of shackles, where rusted chains still hung from wooden posts. A tattered cloth, perhaps once a uniform, lay crumpled on the floor, stained dark. A room of carvings, filled with childlike drawings etched into the walls. Dozens of stick figures, some whole, others half-buried beneath stick plant rows. One image showed a tall woman with claws and black eyes feeding a man into the earth. A vault of offerings, lined with crates filled with yellowed teeth, bones, blood-soaked clothing, and something wrapped in burlap, still moist. Charles didn't open it. He began to understand. This was not just a place of death. It was a temple. This network had been carved over centuries. A sacred, secret space for rituals meant to feed whatever ruled beneath the soil. The Beaumonts hadn't simply made sacrifices. They had preserved their sins like relics. He moved deeper still, following the sound of dripping water? Or was it blood? Eventually, he reached the central chamber. It was vast, round, and terrible. In the middle stood an altar made of stone and root, twisting into a throne-like shape. Around it were 41 small mounds of dirt, uneven, each marked with a wooden token. One token still bore a name, Elijah Turner. Charles stumbled backward. That's when he heard scratching. From one of the mounds, the soil shifted. A pale, half-decayed hand clawed through the dirt. Then another. Then a face. Vacant, eyes clouded white, mouth sewn shut with black twine. It was Elijah, but he was not alive. Charles backed into the wall as more mounds began to stir. One by one, the missing began to rise, not as men, but as hollowed vessels, walking memories held together by smoke and ritual. They moved without sound. They didn't chase him. They only watched. From behind him, something massive moved in the shadows. A rustling like dry leaves, a scent of burning roots. Charles turned slowly and saw her, the Root Mother. She towered above the altar, a form carved from bark, bone, and ash. Her arms were long branches ending in clawed fingers. Her face was not a face, just a hollow, gaping mouth in the center of twisted roots. Eyes like burning coals stared into him. Charles dropped to his knees. He couldn't breathe. She leaned forward, vines coiling toward him. Her voice did not come from her mouth. It came from the earth beneath. You walk in secrets. You breathe borrowed time. Shall I root you? Charles gasped. Why? Why the sacrifices? Because they forget. Because they consume and never give. Because this land remembers the taste of blood. The Beaumonts learned to feed. And I gave them fruit. He stared up, trembling. You're a lie. You're not a god. You're a parasite. The vines retracted, twitching. Then why does your blood stir in my soil? Charles's eyes widened. What? You are not guest. You are seed. You are Holling, born of Beaumont. Everything spun. His mother's name, the sealed records, his sudden offer to oversee the plantation. It had never been coincidence. He was one of them. He turned and ran. The undead did not move. The root mother did not follow. She didn't need to. He carried her in his veins. Back on the surface, dawn was breaking. The smoke had cleared. But now Charles knew. He was not escaping the plantation. He was the plantation. The morning sun cast its golden light over the Beaumont plantation, but for Charles Holling, it was the coldest sunrise of his life. The warmth did nothing to dry the sweat clinging to his skin. He had seen the root mother. He had looked into the pulsing heart of something older than time, older than humanity, and it had known him. Blood of Beaumont, child of the pact. He staggered into the manor like a man escaping war, dirt still clinging to his hands, the echo of whispers still alive in his ears. Cletus was waiting in the hallway, as if he had known Charles would return. "You found the door," the caretaker said without emotion. Charles said nothing. He simply nodded and moved past him. His boots left faint traces of soil on the polished wooden floor. Inside his room, he tore open his suitcase, fumbling for the journal, Samuel Tice's, and flipped through the final entries, searching for anything, any note about bloodline, inheritance, the truth of what this place demanded. "I dreamed of vines wrapped around my bones, and when I woke, there were marks. I fear now that this land doesn't just feed, it breeds. The Beaumonts cannot leave. They are not guests. They are roots. Their children carry the pact." Charles sank to the floor, heart pounding. He wasn't just trapped here. He was bound to it. The root mother hadn't attacked him in the underground chamber because she didn't need to. He was already hers. Still, a fire flickered in him. A rage born not of fear, but of defiance. If he was truly part of this cursed lineage, then maybe that gave him the power to end it. He stormed into the dining hall where Eleanor Beaumont sat, calmly sipping her tea as if nothing had changed. Abigail stood silently behind her, clutching a bundle of dried tobacco leaves. "I saw her," Charles growled. Eleanor looked up without surprise. "I know. You lied to me. You brought me here to take the place of the others." "No," she said softly. "We brought you here because the land asked for you." Charles slammed the table. "You're monsters. All of you. Feeding innocent people to that thing." "It is not a monster," Eleanor said firmly. "It is our guardian. The root mother gave this family everything. You think the wealth, the harvest, the untouched soil, you think that came from sweat and planning? No, came from obedience. And that obedience must continue. I won't take part in this." Eleanor stood. "You already have." She reached into her pocket and threw something onto the table. It was a token, a small wooden disc with his name carved into it. Charles Holling. Just like the ones on the burial mounds. "You were chosen the moment you arrived. The pact recognized your blood. The root mother only took time to know you, to decide whether you would serve as sacrifice or successor." Charles's voice cracked. "You want me to lead this horror?" She nodded. "This family is dying. My time is nearly up. Abigail is too young, too sensitive. But you have the strength to hold the line, to keep the pact. Or," she stepped closer, "you can resist and the land will take you anyway. You cannot break the pact, Charles. It is in the soil. It is in your veins." Charles turned to Abigail, who stood expressionless, her eyes almost lifeless. She had seen too much, known too much, was born into silence. "Has she ever known anything but this?" he asked. Eleanor didn't answer. Charles left the room. He spent the day scouring the manor for weaknesses. Any relic, object, or clue that could end the pact. He returned to the hidden passage in the library, descended into the underground network again, and traced every inch of the root-choked temple beneath the fields. It was there he found the original altar, Behind a crumbling wall, buried in dirt and bone, was a circular pit filled with black, resin-like sap. At its center stood a stone totem, carved with the same curling vine symbols seen on the Beaumont tree. Inscriptions surrounded the pit. To end the pact, one must undo the seed. Root must meet fire. The blood that binds must willingly burn. Charles understood. He couldn't kill the root mother with force. She was beyond flesh, beyond form. But he could destroy the source of the pact, the ancestral seed, the heart of the covenant, the living altar. And it would require not just any sacrifice, but Beaumont blood willing to burn itself to ashes. Him. He stood at the edge of the pit, lantern in one hand, a flask of oil in the other. But before he could pour it, Abigail appeared at the edge of the chamber, barefoot and silent. She looked at him with wide, pleading eyes. "Don't. You know what this is," he said. "You've seen the suffering. But the land lives," she whispered. "Without the pact, everything dies." "No," Charles said. "Without the pact, we're finally free." He splashed the oil onto the roots and struck a match. The altar screamed, not with flame but with soul. The earth beneath his feet trembled as the resin caught fire. Roots recoiled like serpents. A storm of wind and soil erupted upward through the tunnels. Cracks split through the walls, and the chamber began to collapse. Abigail reached for him, screaming, "You'll kill us all." "I know," he whispered. He pulled her close, shielding her body with his as the world split around them. Above ground, smoke poured from the fields like a volcano had erupted. The sky turned black. The manor trembled and crumbled, its windows shattering in a violent gust of wind. Workers ran in all directions, screaming, covering their faces from the choking ash. And from deep beneath the earth, a final roar, not of pain, but of rage, echoed into the night. The root mother had been burned. The pact was broken. At dawn, the smoke cleared. The fields were blackened. The crops were ash. The soil, once rich and full, was dry and cracked. The plantation was dead. But so was the hunger. Eleanor Beaumont was gone. Cletus vanished. The tunnels collapsed, burying their secrets forever. Charles awoke beside Abigail, both bruised, burned, but alive. For the first time, the land was silent. No breathing, no whispers, only peace. But peace, as Charles would soon learn, is never permanent. The weeks following the destruction of the root mother's altar were unlike anything Charles Holling could have imagined. The Beaumont plantation, once alive with unnatural abundance, lay in ruins. The tobacco fields were scorched and silent, the manor a collapsed shell, and the once fertile earth beneath it cracked like dried skin. But the horror was not over. It had only changed form. Charles had hoped that ending the pact would set the land free, that the souls bound beneath the soil would rise, rest, or return to whatever afterlife had been denied to them. He had believed that destroying the altar would break the Beaumont legacy forever. Instead, something else had awakened. The first sign came when Abigail stopped sleeping. She no longer spoke unless spoken to, her violet eyes distant, like staring through glass. She would sit for hours beside the scorched field, humming a tune Charles had never heard, low and haunting, like a lullaby wrapped in mourning. Then came the marks. Small, red spirals began to appear on her arms and legs, at first faint, then deepening like branded flesh. Charles watched them form as if drawn from beneath the skin. He recognized the patterns from the carvings under the plantation, the symbols of the pact. The root mother was gone, but the pact lived on, buried in the blood. And Charles was not immune. He began to dream in soil. Each night he found himself sinking, not falling, but planting, as if his limbs were becoming roots, reaching deep into cold, wet dirt. He couldn't scream in these dreams. He had no mouth, only eyes that watched the surface grow more distant as the earth swallowed him. In the mornings, his nails were filled with dirt. His sheets carried the scent of wet moss. He would find words etched into the walls beside his bed. Not carved, grown, like mold. "Feed me. You are the crop now. The root remembers." He tried to leave. Twice he packed a bag, walked down the winding path, and tried to reach the nearest town. But the road never ended. Hours turned into days. The sun never moved. And eventually, the forest would spit him back out at the front steps of the charred manor. The land wouldn't let him go. But what frightened Charles more than the land was himself. He began to hear things. Voices in the rustling leaves. Whispers beneath the floorboards of what was left of the house. And once, while washing his hands in the basin, he looked into the mirror and saw not his face, but Jasper Beaumont's, grinning with root-black teeth. He slammed the mirror to pieces. At night, he heard footsteps pacing the hall. But no one lived there anymore. No one except Abigail. And them. Yes, the others had returned. The 41. He saw them now and then through the fog in the fields behind the trees. Their skin was ashen, their mouths sewn shut, but their eyes screamed. They did not chase him. They simply watched, like ghosts confused by freedom. Sometimes they tried to speak, their stitched mouths quivering, fingers trembling toward him. He understood. They were still bound to him. The root mother was no longer their mistress. He was. The more Charles resisted the truth, the more the land retaliated. Storms struck the plantation every few nights. Rain that smelled of iron, wind that carried shrieks. Lightning carved strange symbols into the ground. The house shook as though it still had a heart beating beneath it. One night, Abigail finally spoke. They sat near the cold hearth, a single candle burning between them. Her voice was soft, too calm for what she said. "You didn't end her." Charles looked up. "What? You burned her body," she whispered. "But not her root. It still grows. It grows in you." He clenched his jaw. "No, I destroyed the altar, the seed, the network." "You destroyed her form," Abigail replied. "Not her will. That was passed down, through blood, from Jasper to Eleanor, from Eleanor to you." Charles gripped the table. "Then what am I becoming?" Abigail blinked slowly. "The next harvest." She reached into her pocket and placed something on the table. A single black seed. Pulsed. Charles stared at it in horror. "That grew inside me," Abigail said quietly. "I woke up choking on it." Charles stood abruptly and backed away. No, this isn't happening. I destroyed everything." Abigail didn't move. "You buried a fire, Charles." But fires spread beneath the ash. The next day, the land began to shift. Literally. The earth groaned under the weight of something pushing upward. Cracks opened in the once scorched fields, releasing new shoots, black vines that grew unnaturally fast. Within hours, the fields were alive again, but not with tobacco. These were bone stalks, covered in leaves shaped like eyes. And from their base, the smoke began to rise again. Charles fell to his knees in the center of the field, staring into the eye-shaped leaves, and whispered, "What do you want from me?" The land answered not with words but with memories. Visions flooded his mind. Jasper's first offering of a child's blood to a root altar. Seraphine Beaumont chanting beneath a red moon. Eleanor slicing her own palm to anoint the soil. Generations had given willingly. Now it was his turn. But something resisted within Charles. A sliver of humanity, or perhaps hope. He would not feed the land. He would burn it all. One last time. He returned to the ruins of the manor, found the old cellar where supplies had been stored, and began pouring oil into the cracks of the new vines sprouting beneath the floors. Abigail stood in the doorway. "If you burn it again," she said softly, "you may not survive." "I don't care," Charles said. "I'd rather die than become the next Jasper." "You don't get to choose," she said, holding out the black seed. "But you can decide how this ends." Charles looked at the seed, then at the land, then at the smoke curling once more toward the sky. He had one chance left. One final harvest. Charles Holling stood at the heart of a haunted legacy, soaked in sweat and dirt, watching the vines creep back to life across the ruined plantation. Black tendrils slithered along the scorched earth like veins rebuilding a body, pulsing with sap that shimmered like blood. The Beaumont plantation had survived fires, storms, and death. But what it could not survive, what it had never encountered, was a Beaumont who chose to defy it completely. And Charles, though he had never claimed the name, was a Beaumont by blood. He would use that to end it. For good. He had only one match left. One chance to kill the seeds still growing inside him and beneath the land. But first, he needed to find the true root. The one Eleanor and her ancestors had protected, hidden, buried beneath generations of blood and secrecy. Abigail followed him without protest. There was no emotion in her eyes anymore. She walked like a shadow, a child shaped by rituals too old for understanding. As they crossed the blackened field, the wind rose, and with it came the voices. Whispers layered on whispers. Don't bury the blood. One more will be enough. You carry her mouth. Rooted, rooted, rooted. Charles ignored them. He gripped the oil can in one hand, the last match in the other, and kept moving. They reached the first field, the same one where he had found the trapdoor weeks ago. But now the ground was different. The vines were thicker here, forming spirals that curved inward toward a central point. In the middle, a massive knot of roots rose from the ground, like a tree stump, but it pulsed like muscle. It was alive. Charles approached slowly. The closer he got, the more he felt it inside him, a thudding rhythm syncing with his heartbeat. His vision blurred. The world pulsed in and out of focus. The voices grew louder. Lie down. Become. Let us feed. He staggered. Abigail reached out to steady him. It's calling you, she whispered. You're its final fruit. Charles clenched his jaw. Then I'll make sure it dies with me. He unscrewed the oil can and began to pour. The moment the liquid hit the roots, the ground trembled. Screams erupted from beneath. Not human screams, but earth screams, like trees wailing in fire. The vines writhed violently, curling back, hissing. Sap sprayed into the air, thick and red. He emptied the last drop of oil onto the root, then lit the match. But just as the flame neared the wood, the vines struck. They lashed out, wrapping around his legs and arms, yanking him into the air. He dropped the match, it extinguished in the dirt. The vines hoisted him above the root mass, suspending him like a ritual sacrifice. The pulse in his chest grew faster and then stopped. His heart had gone still. In its place, a second rhythm began, the root's heartbeat now echoing inside him. Abigail screamed. From the soil, the dead rose again. Elijah, Samuel, Mama Ruth, all 41. Hollow-eyed, mouths stitched or broken, moving as one. They circled the root, reaching toward Charles with hands of bone and soil. He was becoming the new vessel, a new altar, a new jasper. Take root. The voice of the root mother boomed within his skull. You are air. You are soil. You are mine. Charles closed his eyes and remembered something. Prayer. Not to gods, but to himself. He thought of his mother, the woman who had escaped the Beaumont name, who had never spoken of her past. He remembered her telling him, if the past tries to own you, burn it down. He reached into his pocket. There was one thing he hadn't used, the black seed Abigail had given him. He pressed it to his chest, where his heart had stopped, and whispered, then take all of me. The seed cracked. A white flame burst from his chest, not like fire, like light, pure, hot, unrooted light. The vines recoiled in agony. The root mother screamed. Charles fell, landing hard on the root. He didn't hesitate. He struck the dry bark with a stone. Once, twice, until sparks flew. The fire caught. It climbed up the vines, racing across the root, leaping from tendril to tendril, igniting the underground veins that had fed on centuries of blood. The ground howled. The dead turned to ash. The vines burned black. And the root mother at last began to die. The screams turned to silence. The pulsing stopped. And the land went still. Charles awoke in ash. Abigail knelt beside him, face streaked with soot. Is it over? He whispered. She nodded. You burned the seed, she said. There's nothing left for it to grow in. He He sat up slowly. The fields were gone. Nothing but cinders and dust remained. The sky was clear, the first time he'd seen it without smoke. The earth no longer whispered. There was no more pact. No more root mother. No more Beaumont curse. But the cost was carved into him. His veins were blackened. His heart beat slow. The seed may have died, but its mark remained. He looked at Abigail. What now? She smiled for the first time. We plant something new. Over the next months, Charles and Abigail worked to rebuild. Not the plantation, but the land. They tilled the cursed soil, scattered salt and wildflowers, invited families from neighboring towns to settle the area. They told no one the truth, only that the land had been sick. And now it was healing. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, Charles stood at the field's edge and watched the wild grass grow. Unshaped, uncontrolled, alive. For the first time, it wasn't whispering. But if you listened very carefully, you could still hear a voice, buried deep beneath the earth, waiting, watching, whispering. The harvest always returns. Years passed, seasons changed, and with them, the once feared lands of the Beaumont Plantation faded into memory. First in whispers, then in rumor, and eventually in silence. Where blackened tobacco once grew, now wildflowers bloomed. Where bones were buried beneath blood-fed soil, now children ran barefoot, their laughter replacing the cries of the forgotten 41. The manor had long collapsed, its ashes taken by wind and time. Nature reclaimed what man had twisted. But some stories never die. Charles Holling, once overseer, then savior, now ghost of a name, had stayed on the land for only a few more seasons. Long enough to oversee the return of balance. Long enough to make sure nothing stirred beneath the soil. And then, he vanished. No grave, no body, no goodbye. Only a small wooden carving was left behind. A seed split open, with flames etched on either side. Beneath it, scrawled in careful handwriting, "Let nothing root in silence again." Abigail, now a young woman, stayed. She didn't speak much. She never married. She lived quietly in a modest cabin on the edge of the old field. To the new settlers, she was just a kind soul who helped with births and buried the dead with care. But in her dreams, she still heard the soil breathing. And she knew that while the pact was broken, the memory of it remained. Like smoke that clings long after the fire is gone. 50 years later, 1942, a young man named Thomas Ellison, a surveyor for a land development company, arrived with blueprints, dreams of suburban housing, and no knowledge of what the land had once been. He stood at the edge of the field, clipboard in hand, as the wind tugged at his hat. Perfect place for families, he said to himself. The area was lush. No signs of struggle, no signs of rot, just open, fertile space, untouched by war, far from city noise, kissed by sunshine and framed by mountains. The only strange thing he noticed was a single crooked tree stump in the middle of the field, petrified, blackened, and surrounded by flowers that never seemed to wilt. He took a picture. That night, he stayed at a local inn and asked the innkeeper about the area. "Used to be a plantation," she said, wiping a glass. "Long time ago. Burned down. Beaumont, right?" She nodded slowly. "That's the one." He chuckled. "Funny. I didn't find any ruins." "That's because folks buried them," she replied. "Some things are better left forgotten." Thomas laughed it off. But later that night, he dreamed of vines wrapping around his neck, of eyes growing from tree bark, of a woman with a mouth made of soil whispering, "The land remembers." He woke in sweat, convinced it was nothing but stress. He returned the next morning to finish his survey. As he stepped onto the field again, a breeze kicked up dust and petals, and on the wind, ever so faint, came a whisper, "The harvest returns." He turned sharply. There was no one, only the stump. But now it wasn't a stump. It had split open down the center. Inside, nestled in shadow, was a seed. Black, beating, waiting. Epilogue legacies are not always chosen. Sometimes they are inherited. Sometimes they lie dormant. And sometimes, when fed with just the right amount of silence, time, and forgetfulness, they grow again. The Beaumont curse had been burned. But it had not been erased. It had merely gone underground, waiting for the next rain, the next root, the next name to forget the past. And when it does, when the last whisper has faded, the land will open its mouth once more and begin to feed again. 3.